every company today is a technology company. Really, whether you want to be or not, you have to be thinking about technology in order to be able to keep up with the Joneses, to keep up with the competition, and to be able to serve your clients in the way that they expect to be served today. I mean, people have an expectation that you're going to have a website and you're going to be able to do some e-commerce related transactions. It's just more and more the way of the world. And as any kind of organization, you have to be able to support that, and you have to be able to make yourself very easy to work with. I oftentimes say, the two things I look for in a vendor is, one, that they're super easy to work with in terms you can do self-service, you can do whatever you need to do at just about any hour of the night. And then secondly, that if you have a problem, you can talk to a real person and get a real solution from them. So that's what I am always suggesting to customers to be thinking about in terms of their grower or client experiences. How can they make it as easy and self-service friendly as possible, but when they need help, how can you make sure that you're getting them the help that they need? So with those couple concepts in mind, it talks about what do you need to do to be able to support that first initiative, which is making yourself very self-service friendly. And so let's talk about what kind of investments are needed in an IT team in order to be able to get there. So seen lots of different sizes of IT team, everywhere from 0 people to, I think one company I worked with had 55. Certainly you've got billion-dollar companies that have hundreds of people in IT. So what is the right size of an IT team? So the typical rule of thumb outside of the ag industry would be that companies spend anywhere between like 3 and 7% of their revenues on an annual basis on IT. So if you're a $100 million company, you'd spend between 3 and 7 million on IT in general. Now, of course, as you all know, the margins are much smaller in the ag world, and typically, an average margin, which might be in the non-ag world somewhere around 9–10%, is probably around 3% in the ag space. So you need to adjust your budget is a little bit in the ag world as well. So I would say you want to spend between 1 and 2% of your revenue each year on IT and technology related. Again, depending on the number of initiatives you have, that might go up one year if you're implementing a new system. It might go down in a year where you don't have major projects, but that's a good rule of thumb to be thinking about. And then the smaller the company you are, unfortunately, that means the higher percentage you should spend on IT. You're going to need to put some time and energy and focus to make up for it. The larger you are as a company, the more value you get from the scale of having a larger organization be able to do IT things across a broader number of employees and a broader amount of revenue. So large companies can spend a little closer to 1%. Smaller companies might have to spend around 2% of their overall revenue in IT. So once you've got that started, what is the first big step? Well, the first big step is, again, to start at the top and find the right leader for your IT organization. So if you're going to really take IT and the digital transformation seriously, I think it makes sense to appoint an executive to oversee that team, whether they call that a CIO or executive vice president of technology or CTO, chief technology officer. It could be any of those particular titles, but if you really want to have leadership there and you want to have the rest of your leadership team thinking about innovation and what can they do to drive technology, I really think it's important to have a seat on the leadership team that is really focused on technology. And so some of the things that they'd be focused on are, how do we approach problems? How can we use technology to help us approach those problems? What is our vision for IT and the projects that we're going to need to get done? How do we manage the costs and expenses? How do we support the business? And then how do you build the right team? And how do you have the knowledge to build the right team who's going to help you accomplish that? One of the challenges I see when a company doesn't have an IT leader is they hire an IT person, but they really can't assess that person's quality because they don't have the background themselves. So they could hire somebody who's mediocre and they might think they're great because they have nothing else to compare them to. So, if you don't have and you can't afford an IT leader or executive who can sit on your leadership team, then I would suggest working or partnering with an outside firm who can help find the right IT people for your organization and help you evaluate those people so you know whether they're doing the job well or not. And then you got to prioritize the right roles in the organization. Again, depends on the size of your organization where you want to invest in which particular roles for that group. So we'll talk a little bit more as we go through about that. So one of the things as you're thinking about building an IT team is this concept of a generalist versus a specialist. So a good way to be thinking about this is in doctors as well. So if you're a small rural community and you could only afford one doctor, are you going to get a hematologist or are you going to get a general practitioner or emergency room doctor? You're going to get a general doctor who can handle lots of different things. And then if somebody has a blood problem, you're going to send them nearby to the hematologist for that particular issue. And the same kind of comes into as you're building an IT team when you've got limited staff and limited budget. You have to think about getting generalists. You can't really afford deep experts in IT any more than a town like the one I live in of 2,600 could afford a hematologist and a brain surgeon and a dermatologist and gastroenterologist or whatever you call those. You can't necessarily afford that. You have to focus on more generalist type roles. So you want to concentrate on people who can span multiple areas and span them pretty well and know a little bit about a lot of things. And then you also have to be understanding that you're going to have to spend some money on those experts, just like you're going to have to go get a hematologist when someone has a strange blood problem. You're going to need to go out and get experts, and here are some of the areas where you might need to get an expert. So security, if you're concerned about that, security is definitely a highly specialized area within IT, and depending on how far you want to go down that road, you're probably going to need to pull a security expert in to help make sure that you're secure from outside attacks. If you want to focus on some of the newest cutting edge stuff like machine learning, certainly Internet of Things or IoT is a big deal in the agriculture space. Artificial intelligence, those are all areas where you're probably going to want to look to get a specialist brought in. Business intelligence, so depending on what you're trying to do on the reporting side, you may need to bring in an expert to help you with that, especially if you're going to do something like a data warehouse, which is a great tool, but really requires a specialist a lot of times to get set up. And then an ERP and CRM. So if you're deploying business applications, you're going to need specialists who can help you deploy those business applications. But you certainly still want to have a generalist who has a pretty good understanding of those technologies as you move forward. So now let's think about what the impact that the cloud has on IT teams. So it used to be in the pre-cloud world, your IT team would be having a lot of what I call IT operations people. So people focused on networks and servers, and you'd have database administrators a lot of times in the previous world. But you would oftentimes have multiple people whose job is to keep all the servers running and keep them all up and deal with offsite backup and all of those things that come with having on-premise servers. But in the world of the cloud, that can get to be pretty different. And so I've seen a big change in the roles that are in IT now that more and more things are hosted in the cloud. So as all applications are moving to this more cloud-hosted model, I mean, you're seeing it over and over again. Just about every application is moving to cloud-hosted so that you don't have to have that ongoing internal burden of managing those on-premise resources. So this is changing the requirements from the IT operations side. So instead of being a database administrator and managing, 12 different servers, they're going over to managing more of the network side of things and more of managing individual computers instead. And then you're seeing the investment shift to having more people hire application specialists, so people who are business analysts who really understand the area of the business and how that works with IT, or really application specialists, somebody who knows an ERP or CRM solution. So that's where I see more and more in the investment going. So you used to have, if you had a 10-person IT team, you had 8 people in IT operations and 2 on the application side. And now it's shifting to be nearly the exact opposite. You still need IT operations folks, but the more and more IT application folks you have, the better value you're getting out of your IT team. So we think about, some of the systems that you guys are managing today. You think about how they get managed and what falls into the IT operations camp versus the IT applications camp. So on your IT operations side, you've got networks, you've got multiple different locations, you've got servers and scale systems and things like that out at each of those locations. So you've got to make sure that your network is working, and you've got to make sure that you've got support for those locations. So from an IT operations standpoint, there's an investment there. And then, everyone's got laptops, or maybe they've got apps on their phone that they need to be managing. You've got printers out in the field and a lot of times outdoors. You do still have some amount of servers likely, so you're going to need to manage that as well. And you're going to need a help desk operation that sits in the IT operations side as well. So when you're thinking about building out your team, you're going to need that because you have those systems that require that specialty. Now on the IT application side, that list of things that you need to manage is getting longer. So you probably got an agronomy system, you might have a separate grain system, you might have a separate system for your portal or mobile app, reporting and BI, pulling data together across all those different applications. You might have a different system for patronage or equity management. And then there are a lot of third-party systems that are involved as well too. So even if all of those top things are something that are managed by one application or a small number of applications, you're typically still going to need a blending solution, might need an e-commerce solution. But for sure, if you do agronomy, need a precision ag solution. Work order management solutions are more and more popular if you're managing applicators and things like that. So those are all things that you got to be thinking about and trying to come up with a game plan for how to manage. So what does an ideal team look like? So I'm going to start with if you could have a ton of people on your IT team, how would you structure it? And then we'll narrow it down and go into some of the examples of smaller IT teams and how you would move forward with that. So in an ideal team structure, you would have a chief information officer who'd be leading the organization overall. You'd have an architect. An architect is responsible for how all the applications interface together, how integrations work. That person is typically going to be the person that everything needs to run through in terms of is this the right approach to how we're doing things? So architect is a very important role, oftentimes one that does not get filled. And sometimes the CIO or the IT application director essentially fills that architect role. You certainly can do that if you've got the person with the dual capability there, but having an architect is a good thing. And we talked about IT operations, the network system engineer, help desk techs. Depending on the size of your organization, it's going to depend on how many folks you have in help desk. But then on the IT application side, you would have a director, and then you'd have several different people there. So you might have a business analyst who's focused on the agronomy and maybe finance and HR. So that means they become a business partner of the agronomy team, a business partner of the finance and HR teams. That means they sit in on their leadership meetings, they understand where they're going as an organization, and they're trying to provide IT solutions that are going to help those organizations or departments that they support. Similarly, you'd have a business analyst on your commodity or grain side or in the sales side. So focused on that business, understanding what they do, what their needs are, so that you can find solutions for them. Then depending on the size of the organization, you're going to have developers. So they might be working on your ERP or CRM system or your business intelligence system or your line of business app that you've built homegrown. But depending on the number of systems that you have and the ones that you want to be able to modify, you're going to need developers for that. And anytime you need developers, you need quality assurance folks, so testers. Now, some organizations will have your business analysts fill that role, and if you're a smaller organization, that makes sense. But the more developers you have, the more typically should be about a 2-to-1 or maybe 3-to-1 ratio of developers to quality assurance folks. And then business intelligence. So who is responsible for all the reporting and what the executives are looking at from a dashboard standpoint, what each of the department managers are looking at, how are you interfacing with them to get the right requirements, to get them the information that they need to be able to run their business effectively. So your business intelligence resource is going to work with them and make sure that you're getting the right information out of your system. And then a critical part of any structure, and there may be multiple of these too, depending on how many projects you have going on, is a project manager. So the project manager is building out sprints and schedules for every project that you've got going on within your IT portfolio. So they may be managing 2 or 3 or 4 projects at any given time. And if you've got more projects than that, then you would typically need a project manager. So those are some of the roles, and I'm happy to dive into them in more detail if you are curious about what those roles are and how they might make sense in your organization. So what do you do if you can't afford that large of an IT team? So one of the things you can look at is something that we're big believers in here at Stone Ridge and Leverage. We use this entrepreneurial operating system model that was described in a book called Traction by Gino Wickman to run our business. And one of the things that they talk about is thinking about it and not as an organization chart, but an accountability chart. And the idea behind an accountability chart is, what are all the things that we have to do and who's accountable for them? And then we'll worry about who fits, where on the org chart after that. But it's really focused on making sure that you've got someone managing or someone responsible for all the areas that you need to manage. So thinking about that and building out something called a RACI chart is a good thing for you to do to make sure you know who's responsible and accountable for each of those areas. And you can have someone who spans multiple areas, then you just want to kind of roughly allocate a percentage of their time to those tasks so that they can make sure that they're going to be successful. And then you've got to find those areas where you have gaps and you're going to need to pull in an external resource to help get you through. So now let's look a little bit at how you would build an IT team in a smaller organization. So let's say you're a small company and you really can't afford any kind of IT team. Well, you can't afford not to have any kind of IT help. So, but let's think about the pros and cons of this solution. So first off, it limits your internal expense if you don't have a resource internally, if you don't have a lot of money to spend on it. You can save that money. But there are lots of challenges that come with that. First, you're going to have to be reliant on an outside party for your IT knowledge and capability. So a lot of times you'll work with a firm like a managed services provider who will come out and manage your scale systems or manage your servers or help set up computers for your new hires and things like that. So you'll be reliant on them, and if they're great, then you're good. If they're not so good, then you're going to suffer as well. And then without an IT person in your organization, it's going to be hard for you to stay up on technology trends unless you have a particular leader who really wants to spend the time and energy on that. So how would you pull this off? So you'd outsource your help desk to a managed services provider. You'd appoint a leader to help drive strategy and try to stay in the know on technology. But that's what I would advise to someone who is saying, we don't have the money to spend and we can't have an IT team at all. So, here's what I would think about. Now, if you can afford one person, where would you put that one person? So The focus of that, in my opinion, would be on the IT operations side, so help desk, hardware, a little bit of understanding of the core applications, but then they're going to have to do some vendor management because you're going to have to outsource things. They're going to have to be responsible for that as well. So those would be the areas that I would have them focus on. So some of the pros, again, saves money. It does give you a base level of services and an individual accountable within the organization for those services to be provided, so you're not completely reliant on an outside resource. But the challenge is you're really dependent on that one person. What happens when they go on vacation? What happens if they leave? You're putting all your eggs in that particular basket, which is challenged. And then, like I mentioned before, it's hard for a leadership team member to evaluate an IT resource if they don't know anything about what they do or how they should be going about doing it. In that case, you're going to want to try to get some outside expertise to help you get a picture of whether you've got the right person for your organization or not. Now, if you think about two resources, well, then you kind of go with an IT operations and an IT applications person. So you can divide up the hardware networks on one side, and on the IT app side, you've got the productivity, business applications, and things like that. So now you're getting a little bit more coverage. They can help each other out, back each other up, and that's a lot of better situation. So I hope that gives you some idea of what roles you should be thinking about or how you would go about building an IT team to support those applications that we talked about. So I can't talk about ag IT without talking a little bit about the nature of getting IT resources into rural areas. So I found this really interesting, the urbanization trend over the past 50 years, 60 years. Back in 1960, about 130 million people were living in cities and about 52 million were living in rural areas. And the rural population has not changed over the past few years, but obviously the urban population has pretty much doubled during that time. And it's difficult to find great IT resources in rural areas. So what are some things that you can do to be able to attract those folks? So one opportunity is work with local universities. If you have a university in the area and they've got a computer science program or a master's in information systems program, look for people that are coming out of that college who want to stay in a small town or from the area, and those are great opportunities to try to get folks. We've had a few of our customers who've done a great job of doing internship programs and then having those interns become full-time once they graduate. You see a lot about attracting doctors or teachers to rural areas as well too. So that is another thing, if you're really struggling, that you can come up with some kind of plan to try to attract resources by getting people to spend a certain amount of time or trying to target people who are in high school today that you want to come back to your town long term. What can you do to help offer them some incentives to be able to make that happen? Another option is considering the idea of having remote resources. They don't have to actually be in your community. With what we've learned from the COVID-19 crisis and things like that, a lot of people are able to work from home. As an organization, we have a little under 200 people, and they're across 32 different states. So we're certainly not seeing them every day, yet they're able to be productive and helpful. So you can certainly hire resources that are not in your particular location, especially on the IT app side. A little harder on the IT app side if they've got to actually go around to a scale system. And then I would recommend is when you put jobs out there that you use some of the common job boards like Indeed and LinkedIn and Monster and things like that, and not as much of the ag specific boards, because IT resources maybe are not going to be looking out there as often. So I hope this helps give you a picture of what an IT team looks like and how you go about trying to recruit folks to your organization.